After the death of their father, the two brothers were supposed to share the inheritance equally, but everything turned into a violent conflict. Assault, broken ribs, knocked out teeth, and shocking accusations of infidelity, what should have been a simple legal procedure turned into a real family war. One demands an increase in his share due to the damage caused, the other insists that he acted in a state of affect. The court has ruled, but will it put an end to this story, or will it only fuel the feud? Chapter 1. The beginning of the court session. The sun streamed through the courtroom's huge windows, painting the oak benches and walls golden. Judge Richard Montgomery, a stocky man with gray temples and a penetrating gaze, slowly took his place on the platform. He tapped the hammer on the wooden surface. The court of the state of Illinois declares the session open. His voice was deep and commanding. Case No. 2025-0417 is under consideration. Thomas Henderson v. Nicholas Henderson. The plaintiff requests a review of the distribution of the estate of the deceased Robert Henderson, as well as compensation for physical and moral damages. Thomas, a man in his early 40s with close-cropped brown hair and a bruise under his left eye, clenched his fingers nervously. His right arm was plastered, and every movement was accompanied by a grimace of pain. His lawyer sat next to him, Michael Lawrence, a tall, thin man in a strict, dark suit. He looked at his client and patted him lightly on the shoulder. On the other side of the hall, in the place of the defendant, sat Nicholas Henderson, a tall, stocky man with short blonde hair. He looked irritated, his jaws clenched tightly. His lawyer, Linda Pearson, seemed completely calm. She was used to such matters and was confident in her abilities. Plaintiff, please state your case. The judge pointed to Michael Lawrence. The lawyer stood up, straightened the lapels of his jacket, and took a step forward. Your Honor, my client, Thomas Henderson, faced an act of violence by his own brother following the death of their father. Because of this brutal attack, he got a broken arm, jaw, and ribs. We believe that this situation is unprecedented and demand revision of inheritance distribution taking into account the damage caused. In addition, our lawsuit includes a claim for moral and physical damages in the amount of $50,000. Nicholas snorted and snorted mockingly, drawing the judge's attention. Defendant, your position. Judge Montgomery asked sternly, looking at Nick. Linda Pearson stood up and leisurely stepped forward. Your Honor, my client does not object that there was a conflict between the brothers, but he strongly disagrees with the fact that it affects the distribution of inheritance. Illinois law does not provide for the ability to change the shares of the inheritance based on such events. Brothers are equal heirs and should inherit equally. So you admit the fact of the attack? Lawrence asked sharply, turning to her. We're not denying there was an argument. Pearson kept her expression neutral. But my client acted in a state of affect without being fully aware of their actions. He repents and is ready to compensate for the costs of his brother's treatment, but does not agree to change the inheritance agreement. The judge carefully listened to both sides, picked up the documents with the case materials, flipped through them, and leaned forward. Okay, let's figure it out. Plaintiff, tell me in detail what happened that night, and let's go without unnecessary emotions. Thomas sighed and prepared to tell a story that turned his life upside down. Chapter 2. Testimony of the Plaintiff. Thomas Henderson rose from his seat and, carefully adjusting the cast on his right arm, approached the podium. He wiped his sweaty palms on his pants, took a deep breath, and tried to control himself. His gaze swept over the judge's face and then down to Nick, who sat with a stony expression on his face. Mr. Henderson, Judge Montgomery said to him, tell the court what happened that evening. And please, clearly and without emotion. Thomas nodded and began his story. It was an ordinary evening. I finished work, returned home. My wife was not at home. She was late at work. As I said, I have an acquaintance, Sarah Bennett, who I sometimes hang out with. She knows when she can come because I put a pot with a flower on the windowsill as a sign. That's how we have it. So, interrupted the judge, this flower was a kind of signal. Yes, Your Honor, Thomas confirmed, but it turned out that my brother also learned about this signal. He lives in the same block, and somehow, by accident or not, He guessed it. And that evening, everything went awry. Thomas took a breath and continued. I put out a flower. I was waiting for Sarah. But suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Not her. My brother's wife, Emma. She stopped by just for a minute to borrow a mixer. I didn't even have time to offer her water when the real thing started hell. What happened? Clarified the judge. A few minutes after she left, the door literally flew off the hinges. Thomas's voice rang out tensely in the silence of the hall. Nick ran in. His eyes were red with rage. He did not ask anything, did not listen to any explanation, just rushed at me like a beast. What exactly did he do? Attorney Lawrence asked. He grabbed me by the throat and punched me in the stomach so that I fell to the floor. Thomas continued, his voice shaking. Then I grabbed the same pot with a flower who stood on the window and smashed it against my head. Everything around went in circles. I heard him yelling something about treason, that he would kill me if I went near his wife again. I tried to explain, but he kept hitting. And no one called the police? Asked the judge, raising his eyebrows. I was in shock. I could barely move. Thomas shook his head. It was difficult for me to even speak. Eventually, neighbors heard the commotion and called the police themselves, but by the time they arrived, Nick had already fled. I stayed lying on the floor and then went to the hospital. There was silence in the hall. The judge made a few notes, then looked up. Okay, Mr. Henderson. Now let's hear what your brother has to say. Defendant, are you ready to testify? Nick just pursed his lips and stood up. It's time for him to speak. Chapter 3. Testimony of the defendant. Nicholas Henderson rose slowly from his seat. He looked tense, but held himself steady, even though his fingers gripped the edge of the table tightly. Linda Pearson, his lawyer, gave him a subtle nod, indicating that he should speak calmly and without emotion. Mr. Henderson, Judge Montgomery looked at the defendant over his glasses. The court heard your brother. Now we want to hear your version of events that night. Nick sighed and took a step forward. His voice was hoarse, but he tried to speak clearly. Your Honor, I do not justify what happened. I admit that there was a fight between me and my brother, but I want to explain why this happened. The judge nodded, inviting him to continue. I loved my wife. Nick paused for a moment, as if collecting his thoughts. We have been together for 10 years, and although there were certain difficulties, I always believed in her. But lately I've started to notice changes. She became colder, avoided talking, and whenever I asked her what was wrong, she just brushed it off. Nick glanced at Thomas, who sat motionless, but his jaws were tightly clenched. That evening I was returning home and saw this damn flower pot on the windowsill of his apartment. Nick clenched his fists, but quickly pulled himself together. I knew it was his signal. He himself repeatedly talked about his system when we sat together over beer. And what do I see a minute later? My wife enters his apartment. She didn't even look back. I just went in, as if it was necessary. The judge raised his eyebrows. So you think that between your wife and your brother there was an affair? I was at that moment, I am sure of that, answered Nick firmly. I was waiting at the entrance. I couldn't believe my eyes. 10 minutes passed, and she was still there. And then What did you do next? Asked his lawyer, directing the conversation in the right direction. I rushed upstairs. Nick pursed his lips as if recalling that moment. I didn't knock on the door. I just flew in because I was bursting with anger. And what do I see? Thomas is standing in front of me. He wasn't even surprised, and my wife is all flushed, confused. I didn't think so. I just grabbed it. Did you attack him? Clarified the judge. Nick ran a hand over his face. I grabbed him by the collar and asked, "What is happening?" But he did not even begin to explain. He began to wriggle out, to shout that, "It's not what I think." But I'm not a fool. I have seen the way they looked at each other for the past months. In my head, everything became cloudy. I hit him. How many times? The plaintiff's lawyer intervened. Nick paused. His face turned slightly red. I don't know. I don't remember. A few times, but not as much as he says. Nick's voice sounded strained. Yeah, I grabbed that damn pot and threw it at him. But I didn't want to mutilate him. It's just, I wasn't in control. The judge turned over the documents, then looked at both brothers. A tense silence reigned in the hall. So, you claim that you acted in a state of affect? That you didn't want to seriously harm your brother? Yes, Your Honor, I repent. But it was an error. I just wanted him to say justice. The judge made the final notes in the case. Okay, he sighed. Let's move on to the analysis of evidence and final speeches. Time to make a decision. Chapter 4. The Verdict of the Court. The courtroom was filled with intense anticipation. Thomas and Nicholas sat motionless, each absorbed in his own thoughts. Judge Montgomery flipped through the documents slowly, considering what he had heard. He did not like to make hasty decisions, especially when it came to family conflicts that went beyond standard legal disputes. Finally, the judge raised his head, adjusted his glasses, and looked at both brothers. The court carefully listened to the testimony of both sides, analyzed the evidence provided, and studied the legal basis of the case. His voice sounded even, without any emotions. I want to start by admitting that there really was an incident between the plaintiff and the defendant conflict, which got out of control. Were caused physical injuries, as well as obvious emotional harm. Thomas was holding on to the edge of the table, his white-knuckled fingers digging into the wooden surface. Nicholas stared at the floor, but it was clear that he was tense. The judge continued. However, the court cannot consider this conflict as a basis for changes in the inheritance share. The law of the state of Illinois clearly regulates the distribution of the estate, and no physical or moral circumstances can be the reason for its revision. The estate of Robert Henderson, deceased, is to be distributed equally between the two sons, as provided by law. Thomas flinched as if he had been hit. He shook his head in disappointment, but remained silent. His lawyer, Michael Lawrence, didn't look surprised, as if he had anticipated this development. However, the judge made a short pause. The court believes that the plaintiff has full right to file a civil lawsuit about compensation for material and moral damage if he can prove that the resulting injuries were caused intentionally. This is a matter for another jurisdiction, and you have every right to protect your interests within the law. Nicholas clenched his jaws, realizing that the matter was not over for him. Besides that, the judge tapped his pen on the table. The defendant, admitted, who caused bodily harm, and although he claims that he acted in a state of affect, the law does not exempt him from responsibility. The court makes a decision to order Nicholas Henderson 30 hours of community service, which he will work out as part of city improvement programs. Thomas was confused for a moment. He expected a harsher punishment for his brother, but at least something. Nicholas sighed heavily, but said nothing. The judge made a final mark in his papers and raised his gavel. The court announces the decision, in favor of the claim to change the share of the inheritance. The defendant is required to perform 30 hours of community service. The plaintiff has the right to file a separate civil action for damages. The court session is declared closed. The gavel fell, and the silence of the hall burst into a roar of conversation. Thomas shook his head and mumbled softly, "This is not the end yet. I won't just leave it at that." Nicholas looked up at him, and a look flashed between the brothers, full of old grudges, unspoken words, and a deep rift that not even a court decision could mend. The family war is not over yet. Chapter 5. Afterward. The courtroom gradually emptied. People dispersed, quietly discussing the decision. Thomas remained sitting in place, his eyes directed to one point on the table in front of him, where a few minutes ago the judge was reading the verdict. His fingers were clenched into fists, and conflicting thoughts were buzzing in his head. "Well, Thomas?" Michael Lawrence asked cautiously, leaning towards his client. "It's not quite what we expected, but we still have options. We can file a civil lawsuit, seek monetary compensation, and—" "It's not about the money, Michael," interrupted Thomas, raising his head sharply. "It's not about compensation. The fact is that he happened with a slight fright." He looked over at Nick, who had just then left the dock and was walking towards the exit, accompanied by his lawyer. His back was tense and every movement seemed restrained, as if he was trying to hide the storm of emotions inside. "Nick." Thomas's voice sounded clear and decisive, making his brother stop. Nick turned slowly, his face aloof, but there was a faint spark of weariness and irritation in his eyes. "What else do you want?" he asked, crossing his arms over his chest. "I want you to realize, what have you done?" Thomas said, taking a step forward. "You attacked me because of your own stupid suspicions. You broke my arm, knocked out several ribs, and crushed my face. And for what? Because of a mistake, because of your jealousy. Were you just looking for an excuse to attack me?" Nick smirked. "Oh, come on, Tom. Don't pretend to be a victim. I admitted that I was wrong. I got my punishment. What more do you want? That I should kneel before you and beg for forgiveness?" "I want you to truly answer for his actions," answered Thomas coldly. "And believe me, this is not the end. I will file a civil suit. I won't just leave it at that." Something that looked like irritation mixed with anxiety flashed across Nick's face. His lawyer touched his arm, saying something quietly, and he nodded. "Do whatever you want," Nick said, his voice even but strained. "But no, if you go this way, you will destroy not only my life, but also yours." "You've already ruined my life, Nick," Thomas replied, looking him straight in the eye. "Now it's my turn." For a moment, there was a silence between them, cold, heavy, filled with unforgiven resentment and broken trust. Nick then turned sharply and walked out of the courtroom. Michael Lawrence put a hand on Thomas' shoulder. "It's your choice, Thomas, but make sure you really want it." Thomas looked at the lawyer and nodded. He had no intention of stopping. This battle has only just begun. "And what do you think? Was the judge's verdict fair?" Write your thoughts in the comments below the video. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next crazier thing.